Hello, everyone, and welcome to this Let's Talk. It's always great to have your company as we think and share about important issues that our community live with. And today is no exception because we are going to talk about migraines during this Migraine Awareness Week. And it's great to have our expert with us today. It's Roxane Lavanchy. But before we get into it, I just want to share a little bit about migraines because I think it'll surprise a lot of folks who don't know maybe a lot about this issue. We guesstimate that it's about 1 in 7 of us who live with migraines on a regular basis. And a major study that was done last year in 2024 figured out that those who live with what they call headache disorders, of which migraine is one, affect 43% of the world's population. So this is a huge issue, and an issue that unless you maybe know folks or you live with it yourself, you don't know a lot about. So we're going to really get into that today. My name's Donna, and I'm always your host for these LinkedIn sessions. I've got shoulder length brown hair, and I'm wearing a grey Box sweatshirt today because it's a bit chilly out, so the t-shirts have gone in the cupboard. I am joined, as I say, by Roxane. Roxane is a facilitator, a consultant, a researcher, and she works under the name of Shaping Culture, which I think is a fantastic name for a company. Roxane, thank you so much for your company today. It's greatly appreciated.
Thanks for having me, and let me give my own visual description. So I'm a white woman in my late 20s. I have ginger blonde hair in a bob with a fringe, and it's a little bit wavy. I wear gold and brown round glasses, and I'm wearing a light blue shirt. Thanks for having me again.
Brilliant, thank you. Let's start talking then, because there's a lot to get through here. This is an issue very close to my heart, as I'm somebody who suffers myself with migraine. And I use that word suffer because they are really tough when you're going through an episode. But take me right back to basics, Roxane. Tell me a bit about yourself beyond what we've already shared. And why is the subject of migraine important to you as well? I'd love to hear.
Yeah, sure. So as you said, I'm a facilitator, a consultant, a researcher. I work for myself, so I do loads of different things. But everything that I do is about shaping culture, whether that's working with organisations to build more inclusive workplace cultures or environments for their customers and service users, but also thinking more widely about how our lives are shaped by and in turn shaping cultures through culture, media, research. I'm a little bit of a pop culture nerd as well, so I'm really interested into thinking about how does the media, the films, the music that we consume, how is that shaping our realities. And I think that's relevant to migraine as well, in terms of sometimes how migraine is even talked about and maybe minimized in the media. But in terms of what I do equity, diversity, and inclusion training and consultancy. I also do some lived experience research and facilitation, and some thinking and analysis around culture and media, and volunteer for a community radio too. In terms of, I guess, my own experience and of why I do these things, so I'm disabled and neurodivergent myself. I live both with chronic migraine and ADHD. I was diagnosed with migraine when I was around the age of 12, I think. It was quite a long time ago. And then when I was 22, and in my last year of university, migraine became chronic. So the intensity and the frequency really worsened. And at the time, obviously that was a really difficult experience in itself, but I think what made it worse was the difficulties that I experienced in getting the support, both in terms of healthcare but also in my university, and subsequently both in workplaces environment, and also I guess in my social life. I've had both really good experiences of feeling like I was supported and understood, but also negative experiences and barriers that I faced in a workplace. And all of those have really galvanized me into doing the work that I do, I guess, in terms of thinking more widely around inclusion, around disability inclusion, to try and, I guess, change the culture around how we think about conditions like migraine, but also to create systemic change so we are not facing those additional barriers on top of the condition itself.
Amazing. And Thank you for turning your lived experience into something where
Yeah.
you're really making a difference for the community as well. I love that word galvanized. It's such a
Yeah.
great word about, wanting to make those changes. For those who aren't sure then, Roxane, can you talk us through exactly what a migraine is? Might sound a basic question, but I think it's useful for us to hear this, including maybe the triggers and the symptoms of these types of episodes.
Yeah, it's a really interesting question and important one because I think one, migraine is so widespread, but it also is so misunderstood. I think for lots of people, when you say migraine, you think, it's just a headache, but actually it's a lot more a lot more than that. I think the first thing to note is that migraine is a complex neurological condition, and it's a condition that is long term. So, more and more organizations like the Migraine Trust and experts are talking about migraine as a condition and then migraine attacks. So, we live with migraine. It's something that there's no cure for, even though I've been, I think, asked so many times, are you feeling better? Is migraine gone? And it's actually, I'll probably live with an experience of migraine for my whole life, although obviously the frequency might change. And I know for some people after particular events, for example, it might be childbirth, for example, I know of people for whom the frequency of migraine attacks have gone away, but that's really not the point here. So it is a complex neurological condition. There is no cure. There is research around the causes of it. In terms of the symptoms, it can include loads of different things. So it's quite a whole body experience. It's not just a headache. So it might be a headache. For me, it is a sort of throbbing headache, often on the left side of my head, but it can also be characterized with nausea, vomiting, sensitivity to light, to sounds, and fatigue. And there's different type of migraine. So it might be migraine with aura, so with associated neurological symptoms like maybe loss of vision at particular times, sensory things that people are experiencing, or without aura too. So lots of different symptoms. I think each experience of migraine is different in terms of the intensity of it. And I think for me also something that I really want people to understand is that the way it impacts people is not necessarily just, the day that you have a migraine attack, so the day that I experience the headache, but also the impact afterwards. So for me and lots of people with migraine experience that is almost an experience of a migraine hungover. So you have the day where you have the attack, but actually on the days after, and maybe for more than a couple of days, it's the fatigue. It's I think for me really brain fog that are also impacting my everyday life almost as much as the migraine attack itself. Um, Lots of things can be triggers. I think that's what can make it a little bit um, challenging. So, it could be stress, it could be lack of sleep, particular foods. But I'm also really interested in trying to challenge that idea of trigger because I think it individualizes the condition a lot. Like, obviously, it's important to manage your condition. And I know for me, for example, white wine is a big trigger. So I know that I should avoid white wine, and that's my responsibility to do so to manage my condition. But I'm really interested in thinking about what are the wider, environmental and societal things that do can impact the frequency of migraine. So in a workplace environment, for example, it might be the lighting, it might be the noise levels, the not having a quiet space, for example, and that's not just my responsibility, my trigger. It's the way that our society has been built and constructed that are creating environments that maybe are making it more difficult for people to manage their condition. Another one for me, for example, that really think sort of comes to mind is if I have to work in an office and there's a commute. I live in London, I have to take a busy tube where there are all of those sensory sort of triggers, particularly the screeching on the tube line, the big shifts in temperatures, for example. that are not just like my own, my own trigger that I have identified. It can make that, managing that condition a lot more challenging for sure.
It's really insightful to hear you speak in this way, and I think people who don't know a lot about migraine will be surprised by what you've just shared, because
Yeah.
I think for a lot of folks, they will call, and I'm not minimizing this because headaches are horrible, but a
Mm,
headache, we will say, "Oh, I've got a migraine." A bit like when sometimes we might have a head cold and we say it's the flu, when
yeah.
it's actually a bit of a misnaming of something. Because if you live with migraine, as I do, and actually my husband does as well,
Mm,
it's like you shared, Roxane, it is way beyond a headache. Although, as I say, I don't want to minimize people who get bad headaches, because it is truly, all of it is awful. But I really like what you say about the trigger, because for sure, I think sometimes as we get to know ourselves, we can figure out, oh, okay, this is a trigger for me. But sometimes for no reason, a migraine will come on us.
yeah.
And I'm wondering from what you've said, if we constantly talk about triggers, and maybe this is why you don't like it so much to think in this way, is it sounds like that we're constantly in control of when our migraines are going to strike, because you might have had a glass of wine or you've had a piece of chocolate or something, and now you've got a migraine. But, depending on what those triggers are for folks, sometimes there's no reason, like you say, it may have been a busy journey into work or a
Yeah.
stressful day, and suddenly you're developing a migraine.
Yeah, and I think that can make it quite, I think particularly also we know that migraine can, and the experience of it, not necessarily migraine itself, but can have a huge impact on your mental health. And I think again, it is really important to know yourself, to understand how to manage your condition. But I think it's also important to understand, I think more holistically, the the conditions in which we live in, which is we live in a society where, for example, for us to be able to afford to live, we might have to work full time, and that can make managing that condition a lot more challenging depending on the type of work that we do, or the stress of even the cost of living crisis and things
Yeah,
like that. There are loads of things. I think often when we talk about managing conditions, it's about identifying your triggers and identifying what you need. And a lot of the time I know what I need. Maybe that could be maybe relaxing a little bit more. It might be, I think I've been advised that a lot of times, try and get a massage once a month or once a week, and not everyone can afford
no.
those things that might help them manage their condition, manage their triggers. So it can be really helpful, and absolutely it is in terms of identifying those individual things. But also I think it's important to recognize the wider societal structures in which we live in, and particularly in a workplace environment, also thinking about not putting all the onus on the employee, for example, to manage their migraine, but also thinking about how more widely the employers and colleagues can support that. And I'm sure we'll talk about that in a bit.
Yeah, thank you. It's really interesting to get into this like in this way. This is why we really wanted to have this conversation.
Yeah, yeah,
You opened up by saying, thank you for sharing that you're neurodivergent and obviously you live with migraine. Um, Increasingly now, this is what also interested me about having a chat with you. We seem to have this awareness now, that our neurodivergent community can be more prone to experiencing migraines.
yeah, yeah, yeah.
Again, Roxane, can you share thoughts where we're at with that currently? This type of thinking, that is there some connection here?
Yeah. So again, first I want to caveat, I'm not a neurologist. I'm not a scientist looking into migraine. I'm merely a person with lived experience and the expertise within the EDI space. In terms of both, in terms of neurodivergent experiences and living with migraine as well, we know that research is lacking of all of those experiences anyway. I think particularly with migraine as well, it's a condition that maybe in the healthcare system. I know my anecdotal experience is often it's really woven with experiences of sexism as well, because it's
Okay.
a condition that also impacts women as well, in quite high proportions. So could potentially be minimized, and we know that. But just to
Yeah.
backtrack here, I think there is still a small but growing amount of academic literature looking into how migraine might be intersecting with neurodivergent experiences. I think particularly around ADHD and autism. There's some early research that can find some association between the two in terms of ADHD and migraine. There's been some explorations around autistic traits in people with migraine, and that might be revealing a little bit of an overlap. But again, that research is lacking. I think the point here is really that we know migraine is such a widespread condition. You said at the start, it's 1 in 7 individuals roughly. And probably more people who maybe are not diagnosed. I know diagnosed can be quite a difficult thing to access. So it is likely with that huge proportion of people impacted by migraine that there is an overlap, but also in thinking about some of the barriers that people might be facing that could be triggering of a migraine or that can make being neurodivergent in the workplace more challenging. Those experiences are quite similar, I would say. So in terms of the physical and sensory barriers, such as bright lighting, lack of quiet spaces, the smell and loud noises, for example, we know typically are barriers for both of those kind of communities and those overlapping experiences. Thinking about working patterns as well, those sort of like cognitive load of, I know for me, a huge sort of trigger and something that actually can also be changed really easily. I obviously deliver a lot of training, and I've noticed, the way that our documents are formatted, the color combinations that are used, the background on slides, for example, can be really triggering, particularly when spending a lot of time on screen, to my migraine. And those small changes that we're identifying that can also help people with dyslexia, for example, in terms of using a sort of pastel background. They are helpful tools for everyone, and also for people who do not have migraine or people who are neurotypical, for example. So those changes benefit everyone. And we know also more widely some of the challenges around accessing support and adjustments in the workplace, the stigma and kind of pressures to mask those experiences can be really challenging. But also I think something that's really kind of helpful to think about is thinking about migraine as absolutely can be a disability, in terms of it obviously depends on people's experience of migraine. Some people only have one migraine attack every couple of years, so it might not have a huge impact on their lives. But for those of us who do have chronic migraine, it absolutely can be extremely disabling, but also we might want to think about migraine as a neurodivergent experience. The term neurodivergent is not a clinical one anyway. It's that umbrella term that is meant to be really broad and all-encompassing, and referring to this fact that some of us do diverge in the way that we think and process information, and it doesn't really matter how we actually do diverge. So in terms of thinking of my own experience of migraine, even before I was diagnosed with ADHD, like thinking about brain fog and that fatigue and the way that, accessing information, for example, can be a bit of a barrier. That's a neurodivergent experience in itself.
Yeah, it's really interesting to hear you share, wisdom on this, because it's great, and I think very heartening to know that we're starting to think in these ways of the overlaps, people's
Really,
experience
yeah.
in this way. And it's interesting for you to talk about the role that that gender may be here as well for cis females. I'm also thinking about for menopause, for I know a lot of people going through menopause.
Mhm.
We'll talk about an increase in migraines because of hormone fluctuations and so on.
Yeah.
So I think where we're at, we're not where we want to be yet, but I think it's interesting times in how we're starting to figure out how an issue like migraine can impact us in all the different identities that we may live with. So thank you
Mm.
for that, Roxanne. It's really interesting. And this was things that I'd read about as well, and I wanted to speak to you about that because, yeah, it's going to be interesting times ahead, I think, as we see more research.
Yeah.
From a workplace perspective, then, and you've already started to speak about some of the
Yeah.
triggers and so on. Where do you think we're at currently in terms of the awareness, the understanding that employers have, the support that might be out there for folks who are, in the day jobs, navigating through living with migraine. Again, I'd love to hear your thoughts on that.
I think um, I think we're making some progress that I think more widely within workplace inclusion and thinking about disability inclusion specifically, but also I guess with COVID, for example, and we've seen shifts around rethinking our working patterns, for example, and the way that we work. The fact that a 9 to 5 doesn't work for everybody. There's also more awareness, I would say, now around the fact that not all disability is visible, and trying to shift our understanding of disability, which absolutely can be someone who uses a wheelchair, someone who's blind or visually impaired, but also that a lot of conditions and experiences are hidden. Um, but I'd say on migraine itself, there's still real lack of understanding. And I think a key barrier here is really that stigma, those attitudinal barriers, and that lack of understanding from people who do not live with migraine, whether that's other colleagues or whether that's managers and leaders within workspaces. I think something to signpost here, there's some brilliant research from the Migraine Trust that was published this week as part of Migraine Awareness Week that really speaks to that lack of understanding. And there's some key figures, and maybe some of those we can share after the event. But there's still that research surveyed people with migraine and also people who do not live with migraine. And some of the findings, for example, were that 60% of people who do not live with migraine think it's just a bad headache. They were misconceptions around what were the causes of migraine. People within the workplace really reported some challenges around being perceived as lazy, as using migraine as an excuse, for example, um, to avoid work or responsibilities. And there were also some concerns from people without migraine about employing people potentially with migraine. So lots of challenges there, and also in terms of people not feeling comfortable to share their experience and to disclose. And I think people should, I think I did an event earlier this week also around migraine, and I think my key message there was around, there was a question about when to disclose, for example. And I think that word disclosure in itself sounds so quite negative, but people should feel that they can disclose when and when it's relevant for them, or that they can share their experience. And for some, it might be not sharing at all because they have all of the support available anyway and they don't face barriers within the workplace. For some, it might be at the point of interview because you do need some adjustments, and what's put in place already within the interview process is not enough. But for some, it is still really a real fear to share and to ask for the support that they need. And I think that's a real shame, because it's a huge sort of pool of talent that's probably excluded from the workplace, again, because so many of us do live with migraine. And if we have a little bit of that support, if we rethink the way that we work a little bit, I think it could make our experiences a lot better.
And listen to you talk like that. There's echoes there across into the barriers that the neurodivergent community face.
Exactly.
And this is where we see this almost overlap, isn't it? The
Mm,
journeys are very similar, sadly, sometimes about the lack of understanding, lack of support, and so on. I think
absolutely.
that's why it's so great to speak to you in this way, Roxane, for Neurobox to try and do their bit to raise awareness about this, especially with 1 in 7 of us living with this issue. It's huge, isn't it? Absolutely huge. This is not niche by any means. So on the back of that then, and I hope, as I say, we've shed some light on this issue for folks who maybe didn't know a great deal about it. Um, any closing thoughts of what you'd like to share for those who are listening to this? We've already shared that this is Migraine Awareness Week, and it's always wonderful to have these special awareness times, but really it should be Migraine Awareness Week every week because we live with these issues
Right.
ongoing all through the year. But happily, I think when we do have this special time, for some of us, it's a time to stop and think and share information about this, and that's why we wanted to have this conversation.
Mm.
But what would you like to share with those who are listening to us talk in this way?
Yeah, I think for anyone listening that does live with migraine, I think my message here would be that you're not the problem. Yes, you live with that condition, and it can be really challenging. Um, but again, because we spend so much of our time thinking about what are we doing right, what are we doing wrong, it can really be having that negative impact on our self-esteem and on the way that migraine can be disrupting plans, for example, when we might have to cancel things or um, um, calling sick at work, for example. It is challenging, but ultimately that's not our fault. We're all, kind of doing what we can, and really inviting to think. I think what really changed my life when I was at university and when my chronic migraine. When my migraine became chronic, was being exposed to the social model of disability, which says that yes, we might have an impairment, a condition, or a difference, and yes, it might be challenging, but actually the cause of our exclusion, the causes of our marginalization and our exclusion, whether it's in the workplace or what more widely in society, is the way that society is organized, is the barriers that are put in place by society, either attitudinally, either physically, or in terms of communication, for example. And I think that really helped me kind of shift. And that's when, when claiming those labels, and anyone can obviously identify the way they want, but when I started to think of myself as disabled in that sense, that's what helped me and empowered me to claim the support that I deserve for a really long time. Before, I never, you know, had as much as made a request for additional time. For example, in my assessment, I very much felt like I had to do this on my own. And I'm sure in a workplace environment as well, that's the case for so many people, for students, where you think, no, I have to do this. And if not, I'm a failure. And I think, we do need that support. We deserve equitable treatment. It's not special treatment if we request that support. For anyone who is listening, who is an employer or a colleague of people with migraine, or perhaps a teacher or whatever, I'd really encourage people to educate themselves on migraine, and understand that it is that long-term condition. Is very unlikely. I'd love it for myself if one day maybe there it goes away, if maybe there's a cure, but the reality is that's quite unlikely. So I'd rather focus for now on how can we remove those barriers that we face, and make sure that on top of the condition itself, I know for me often it's not the condition itself that's the worst, but it is those attitudes that you're facing. It is those sort of comments about, oh, is it been cured yet, or are you better, or oh, but have you drunk enough water, and those like unsolicited advice. And it is the central environment within a workplace, and the lack of flexibility, for example. So I'd really encourage anyone who's an employer, manager, to think about, and as we would recommend for any aspects of workplace inclusion, to think about how can we all take a collective responsibility to create and foster an inclusive environment. And that might be small things like changing the way that we design our slides. Not all of it has to be really um, you know long term and hard work in terms of the changes. It might be using assistive technology, for example. There's lots of support out there, and maybe that's topic for also a wider conversation around what support and what tools can help, for sure.
Yeah, it's so inspirational to hear you talk, and thank you for
Thank you
everything
for
that
having
you
me.
do to 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 raise awareness about these issues for folks who feel that they're invisible or misunderstood.
Mm.
I loved, as I said earlier, that galvanizing feeling, and that's where we want to be at, where we're galvanizing the community to maybe um, make our voices heard about what it means to live with this condition, really. And we will share that information because Neurobox are galvanised to support the community as well, for
Yeah.
sure. So, Roxane, that just leaves me to say yes again, thank you. And I don't know if you want to say thank you and goodbye to everyone who's been listening because it's been so brilliant. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you so much again for having me, and for anyone listening, either now or on catch up afterwards. Don't hesitate to reach out if you want to partner, collaborate, or have any questions. I'm always very available and up for conversation, and for thinking about how we can change all the things that we've been talking about today.
Yeah, thank you. And I know you're happy for folks to reach out to you on LinkedIn, and I'm sure
Yep.
they will, because there's a lot of us out there who live with with these issues.
Yeah.
So that just leaves me to thank everybody else who's been listening as well. As always, we go on these great journeys with our experts, and today's been no exception. So thank you everyone for your time. I hope what we're going to share in terms of links to Migraine Trust and so on will be really useful for you. But take care, and we look forward to seeing you in the next episode of Nora Box's Let's Talk. Goodbye, everyone.